Hey everybody, I am back. We are going to be talking for this session about my favorite topic, which is offense. We're going to spend some time, myself, Clay, and James from my team talking about a strategy that we deployed at scale in this election in terms of our persuasion work. So the work that we did to reach audiences that we found to be movable away from Trump if delivered certain information and content. And Clay is going to talk a little bit about the strategy at a high level, and then we're also going to talk about how we integrated measurement into our persuasion work from the get-go, and also did it consistently throughout the entire program. So this program that we ran, the Persuasion program, we launched it actually in August of 2019 against Trump. And we did that because at the time, of course, we were still in the midst of a very competitive and crowded primary on the left. And yet Trump was spending millions and millions of dollars on his campaign to drive his own offensive narratives and narratives to frame Democrats as radical socialists on platforms like Facebook and Google and other platforms. And so we knew that we needed to do some offense of our own in the absence of having a candidate and a nominee. And so that was really the reason that we decided to build out this program. We called it 4 is Enough. And David Plouffe, who we'll hear from later with me in the day, who is on our board, joined us to build out this program and this effort. So you can go to the next slide. We're going to be talking, as I mentioned, James Barnes and Clay Shores from the team. Clay is was our political director. He is now helping to run Lockwood Strategy, which was our in-house agency with Shannon Kwalchek and Victor Young-Long, who you just saw. James Barnes joined ACRONYM last year, or in 2019. We're in 2021 now, thankfully, to build out our measurement team and the platforms that we used to continually test and inform our persuasion programs to make sure that they were actually lowering Trump support among audiences that we wanted to turn out and vote for the Democrat on the ticket. Next slide, please. So just the TLDR for this session, and then I'm going to bring Clay on to take it away. So as we all know, because we live in this world, the media ecosystem has changed dramatically. And that doesn't just mean that we have to spend money and resources and energy reaching voters where they are online. It also means that we have to be really creative and intentional about how we break through the echo chambers that we all live in because of the way social media platforms have designed their algorithms to constantly serve us up content that reinforces our existing belief systems. So if we want to be able to introduce new information or ideas to audiences, we have to be really thoughtful about how we do it, and we have to do it in a way that they will be responsive to. So that's an important framing for how and why we designed the strategy and program that we did here. The second, which is the core of the topic of this session, is boosted news, which you're going to hear a lot more about. This is a effective and very affordable tactic that we uncovered through a lot of research and experimentation and program work we did leading up to the 2020 election, but then continued to validate and improve on through this program. And last, of course, measuring persuasion for anyone who has tried to do it working in politics is very difficult. It can be expensive and time consuming and still be really noisy. It is really hard to ever say with great confidence and statistical significance that the creative or the messaging or the ads or even the organizing that you do to shift opinion and support for or against a candidate actually results in those votes changing at the polls. So we approach all of the work that we do in persuasion and measurement with a great deal of humility, and do that because our programs are only as good as effective as they are and as effective as we know they are. And so we also want to know when they don't work so we can tear them down quickly and pivot and learn what does. So it is really important to do that, though, given the amount of money and the high stakes in elections and campaigns. And so we take that work really seriously, and we want to share what we learned along the way with all of you. Next slide, please. So some very obvious contextual framing here. Today, millions of Americans are reached with more disinformation than they are with trusted news or information. We know the results of that. There have been concerted efforts with millions, billions of dollars really over the years behind them to undermine the media, deteriorate trust in our government and institutions and each other. And it has led to the rise of Trump and Trumpism. You hear this probably all the time if you listen to things that we talk about or are just a Politico like we are, that Trump is the symptom, not the cause of this work and these efforts. And so the disinformation epidemic that we have in this country will outlast him. What happened on January 6th was a direct result of those efforts. And so now that we are in a decentralized media ecosystem, it is incredibly imperative and yet difficult that we figure out how to counter these narratives when folks don't look for their own trusted information as much any longer. Next slide. So I'm going to hand it off to Clay to talk about how we approach this work to do that, and then he'll kick it to James.
Thanks, Tara. It's always important that we remember the environment that voters live in. Even what we call low information voters may be low information or engagement about politics and government, but they're likely bombarded by information on a wide variety of topics on a constant basis. That means we often have to meet them where they are when key moments strike. We frequently saw that the power of certain issues was ephemeral. We could move voters on a topic for weeks or months, but the effects from messaging on that topic would diminish as the information became priced in their decision-making. We especially saw this with major news events. For example, the brief news explosion around the Soleimani killing, and even around COVID. We had great success moving opinion on Trump at the outset of the pandemic, but that ability to continue persuasion diminished as voters had become inured to the overwhelming news environment around that issue. So it's key to reach voters, particularly those who consume less political news, when they are open to receiving that new information on a topic. That constant flow of information also makes our job harder because we need to cut through it to deliver the information we want to voters. When you could interrupt a near ubiquitous nightly newscast with a 30-second ad, you had an unrivaled ability to command attention from a broad audience. We all know the trend, but sometimes it's important just to remember some of the details. Something like 27 million Americans tuned in to watch Walter Cronkite every night. That's just one channel in a country with 2/3 the population of today. In today's fragmented context, it honestly feels like an absurdity to even contemplate that number. So that means we need to be smart about finding voters on the platforms where they live and finding methods that both draw their attention, but also don't make them immediately doubt our honesty. It's simply a harder challenge than it used to be, and that's why continuing to innovate with things like boosted news is key. But we also need to listen to the right signals. Measuring persuasion is incredibly hard and moreover costly. I'll turn it over to James shortly to talk about how we measured and validated all of this, but it was absolutely central to the success of our program. It allowed us to get on and, when necessary, off topics and approaches, and helped us narrow our messages over time to increase our effect and efficiency. It also led us to entirely new buying strategies to maximize the reach of effective content to the right audiences. The challenges we face are only going to grow. Hyper-partisanship, fractured news environment, they don't seem like they're going to magically evaporate anytime soon. So continuing to innovate in tactics and measurement is vital to making our work effective in the years ahead. You move to the next slide. So it seems like a simple idea. If you can worm your way into the feed of an undecided American voter with content that they're already expecting to find there, then you can reach them in a way that is measurably different than other ad delivery. In practice, it took a little bit more trial and error than that. We had to develop some ways to quickly assess the value of individual pieces of news and deliver them to the right audience segments. But boosted news does have some key baseline advantages. So I wrote 0 new creative development here, but I'm sure our team that wrote hundreds of copy variations on boosted news ads would probably take a little issue with that. So I'll revise to say that it takes little new creative content. And the copy it does require can be produced quickly and efficiently, and the ads can be deployed nearly immediately to insert your chosen news into the media environment of your key targets in direct competition with any other communication they might get on the topic, or even better, with no competition. And we consistently saw that the audiences with lower political knowledge were moved by boosted news. As I mentioned, measurement and validation are key for good program decisions, but it's also valuable to draft on the knowledge that is built up by the community over time. Part of the value of experimenting on programs of the size and spending power of this one is that we can develop and expand the available tool set. One of the key values of boosted news is that it consistently showed less backlash than more traditional political ads. When moving quickly without the budget or time to test with a quality tool, you can have greater confidence that you will at least avoid moving voters the wrong way by using boosted news. So it's relatively cheap, can be deployed quickly by a small team, and is unlikely to cause backlash. Those seem like valuable characteristics for a lot of programs. But it's important to remember that boosted news and ads also don't exist on separate planets. They work in concert. Delivering your chosen news alongside your ads makes your ads more effective. It helps to lay a credible, third-party validated groundwork to the more forthright claims you're going to make in your more traditional ad formats. And it softens the voters for your other communication. So I just want to be really clear on that point. I'll say I am not saying not to run other types of ads. I'm saying if you have the resources, do both, but make sure they serve a coherent whole, and absolutely don't leave out this simple and effective tool to increase the efficacy of your programs. And now I'll turn it over to James, who will share some about the incredible tools his team built to help make our programs more effective in real time. James?
Next slide. So in light of all the things that Clay said, it was really important for our team, which focused on building solutions to help understand how to measure persuasion, could quickly and effectively understand if boosted news worked. And indeed, the fact that we did that was what led to us being able to scale it. So I'm going to talk about 3 things that we did, and then show some examples of how we built a persuasion measurement framework to make this happen. So first is we built an in-house measurement tool called Barometer to test the efficiency of boosted news and found it to persuade audiences, sometimes more than traditional ads, actually often more than traditional ads. The way the barometer worked was by running random control trials on Facebook, showing some people in a random set ads, other people not, running surveys to both groups and seeing if we changed people's opinions. Indeed, boosted news turned out to often be effective by that standard. Secondly, when we had about 100 experiments under our belt, we used machine learning to optimize our ad delivery, which allowed us to get reads much faster and have our programs respond much more quickly to events, as Clay mentioned, without the risk of backlash, which we shared with the community. Y'all might have seen Tara's coverage about the ha-ha ratio, being able to understand that when people on Facebook react with the ha-ha emoji and your ad isn't funny, that's probably not a good thing. These were the types of insights that through our experiments and then through all the engagement data we had across Facebook and other ads platforms, we were able to institutionalize in a machine learning model, which allowed us to make predictions on every ad without having to run experiments. Finally, we validated our findings with follow-up experiments that gave us the confidence to automate all of this into an ads optimization framework within our persuasion programs, which we called Tornado. We've got a little bit of a Wizard of Oz theme going on in our product naming. This allowed us to source through hundreds and hundreds of news articles each week to try and find the ones that we found to be the most persuasive by Dorothy's measure. Next slide. So you can see here the output here. This is a dashboard that we created for the community, which shows the effectiveness of our persuasion program over time, but also shows one of the most effective boosted news articles that, and I'm squinting here to read the text. Oh, where the president said not to let coronavirus dominate your life, which is definitely triangulating the most effective messaging that we found the entire cycle. And so you can see there on the left, the overall program measurement of everything we did. And then on the right, how we were able to really drill down into individual ads at a speed and efficiency that we just could not do with experimentation alone. Next slide. And we shared these results, as I mentioned, with the community. The dashboard that I just showed before was available to every single member of the progressive community. We had about 10 external partners on board and use our dashboard throughout the course of the cycle, measuring the effectiveness of almost 30,000 individual ads across lots of organizations. I'm really proud of that. But onboarding a technical dashboard is a little complicated when you have a lot of stuff going on. And so we wanted to make sure that we provided these insights for folks regardless of their ability to onboard technology. In order to do this, we created the weekly forecast. We are going wild with the weather metaphors here, where we took all of our programs and found the ads that were most likely, and by ads, boosted news, that were most likely to move voters, and then the ads that were least likely to move voters. And so you can see here, voters did not react well to Trump saying that stimulus packages would come after the election. And so we saw the requisite impact there. We also saw, not often, but sometimes backlash, which we would send out in this email as well. So to sum up, boosted news, super effective. We had a lot of really great tools and a really great team that made those tools happen. And we were able to create both infrastructure, but also communications products to help us communicate these insights with the community, which allowed us to try and get maximum leverage out of the very substantial boosted news program that we put together. So back to Tara, I think, to close it out.
Thanks, James. You can go to the next slide. We'll just do some key takeaways, and then we have a number of questions. And again, if you guys have questions, please throw them into the Q&A and we can try to get them answered. So again, as we've mentioned, the definition of an ad is constantly evolving. And there were some comments in the thread that I saw as well about how you can apply the strategy organically as well, which is critically important. We know that the vast majority of disinformation that spreads online is spread organically, not through ads. We very obviously believe that targeted digital ads are one lever that we have to be able to reach audiences and break through their echo chambers in an effective way. And doing it with boosted news has shown us that it doesn't have the same backlash effect that political ads, even online, can. I think in our hyper polarized and divided political climate right now, this is one of the reasons that we believe that this strategy turned out to be effective, is that it didn't trigger the same responses from folks that political ads can, given, of course, the distrust a lot of Americans have in our politics. Also, as Clay mentioned, taking advantage of key persuasion windows is critical. We saw that as the first group that actually got ads launched against Trump for his failed coronavirus response back at the end of February of last year. And we saw such incredible movement, as James mentioned, through the measurement that we had in that program in that short window of time, and then not so much movement away at that point in time. So there is a lot of old conventional wisdom that you can really only influence voters with persuasion advertising at the very end of an election. And that's just not true any longer. Given the media environment that we're in, you need to be as responsive as the events of the day. And certainly when we're up against how sophisticated the offensive messaging machine is at every level on the right, we can't be stuck in defense. And so we have to be able to take those opportunities quickly, and having the efficiency of not needing to build out a ton of creative and test it in a silo and then launch it is what made this program really unique and effective as well. Of course, messengers matter. As we've talked about, the permission structure that it creates to hear from a conservative messenger, even if you are not conservative, but talking down about something that Trump did or about him, made folks feel that that was a credible voice, and so opened up their mind more to hearing that message come across. Obviously, that means you have to have those messengers that are talking about that, but we were able to find them throughout the election. And all in, boosted news, but also just getting organizations and organizers and activists to share news, in addition to the specific creative or ads of their programs or campaigns, is a really effective tactic, and we hope to see more of it. Also in the state, our political and social environment right now, where trust is at historic lows in our government and our institutions, it's really important that we start to rebuild that trust, especially in different media. And so the right-wing media is not the most dominant voice all of the time shaping the narrative. So I want to be able to take some questions and kick them over to Clay and James as well. So we had one, did you find, I think we did this a little bit, but did you find that news articles from certain sites, CNN versus Fox versus the Milwaukee newspaper, work better than others? What about news articles versus news video clips? Clay, do you want to speak to that?
Sure. So as you mentioned, Sarah, when we could find conservative validators, it was incredibly valuable. Some of this, though, I think has to do with the contours of the presidential election, where in the states that we were in, at the margin of the Electoral College, by definition, you're working with a persuadable audience that is to the right of your average American, just because of the bias of the Electoral College. Unfortunately, that's also going to be true in Senate races and a lot of House races because of redistricting and just the bias of the Senate. So generally, conservative validators are incredibly important. That means Fox has value. And we could find DC Examiner things occasionally that would hit Trump. Different things like that were generally more effective. Additionally, though, locality mattered to the extent that we could find local outlets that were delivering the message that we wanted. Those were also generally more effective than going with a national newspaper. And I would say it's unfortunate, but as you'd expect, your MSNBCs, your New York Times generally tended to be on the lower end of effect or occasionally backlash. And CNN just generally less effective overall than Fox. Pretty simple gradient that I think a lot of people would intuit.
Thanks. And James, question, which specific subsets of voters did you find boosted news to be most effective for? Given how media skeptic many Trump and Trump-leaning voters are, I'd be interested to know exactly who this tactic is most effective for. Do you want to speak just a little bit in more depth on our audience? There's also another session later today with Saul Messing, our chief scientist, about how we built these audiences, if folks are really interested in nerding out on that. He'll be giving a presentation later today. But James, do you want to talk a little bit about the audiences?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So from the very beginning of our program, even before we accumulated these boosted news insights, what we continually found from actually our first experiment on was that folks who we considered to be low information voters, which is I think a topic you've heard a couple times in this chat, were more movable. And we defined that by people who actually failed basic civics questions in the surveys. Like, do you know who controls the House of Representatives, or what's the length of a US Senate term? And so from that insight, as we started to run more experiments with news, we started to notice a pattern, which is that we were particularly more effective with folks who were low political knowledge, especially when we used boosted news. And so that really became the guiding principle that guided our audience definition process. We made a lot of changes as we went along to model who might be low knowledge based off of questions in partner surveys asking how much attention they paid to political news, but also based off of things like their education. We paid a lot of attention to the quality of the audience and how it related to the results that we were finding. Within that audience, though, we also found lots of interesting subsets. You see Tucker Carlson here on the screen in the top right. Clay mentioned the Washington Examiner. When we were able to use conservative messengers, which was really just the rare and golden opportunity when we found the president conflicting with other folks in his party, especially Tucker, who was our golden goose, we were able to move people who said they voted for Trump in 2016. And I recall every time we were in an experiment review and we saw results like that, I saw chills going down my spine because I was like, this is communicating with people in their own language. This is really finding the right message and matching it with the right people. Finally, when we moved to the sort of final phase where we had the whole machine working, inside Tornado, what we tried to do was actually pair the right message based off of the engagement that we saw and its predictions with our machine learning framework to the right audiences. And so within this low knowledge audience, we were trying to find which ads are predicted or which articles are predicted to work best with young women versus old men, as an example. And so in the early stages of our research, as an example, we found that we reliably predicted that Black Lives Matter content would resonate better with young people than with old people, which was a really great face validity finding. So to recap, it was all within the universe of low knowledge voters. But over time, as we found the right types of content to talk to the right types of folks, we were actually able to see movement in some audiences that you might not have expected to.
Thanks, James. And Clay, can you speak to, I know you did a little bit, but other platforms than Facebook where an approach like this might be effective?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can actually see an example of that here. The circle on this spot is actually where this ad sits. I think, if I remember correctly, that this is an Outbrain placement, which is one of several basically native news placements. You know, you often see these used for very silly things like these 5 strange fruits or anything like that. But there's no reason they can't also be used to deliver our information and hopefully to get people to click through them. And they tend to be very cheap placements, and we can also deliver this headline piece of information. We also, though, were able to, even though it's sort of Facebook, very different audience, put them on Instagram through designing specific creative placements. That took a little more work because they don't have the same native tools to do it that Facebook does. But we also were able to use some more classic sort of display-like placements to get this stuff in. But the thing that we always thought was key was that we wanted to deliver this information in a place where it seemed natural. In a newsfeed was obviously the genesis of it because it makes sense there. On Instagram, people are still expecting to get sort of information from their friends, different things like that, which we actually saw accelerate during COVID and during the protests over the summer, where people were delivering more activism and political information through Instagram in particular. And when you are reading an article and being asked to read another article, like in these Outbrain placements or similar platforms, it's just very natural that you're expecting further information. So we never wanted to use something that was totally alien to the information that we were putting out there. Additionally, though, we also use this tactic within video ads. We would cut up essentially Fox segments, string them together in a way that we thought was effective with very minimal additional information beyond maybe some subtitles so that they could be seen when sound was off. And then we delivered those just in classic video ad placements. So really, we took the kernel that we had with the boosted news that we developed on Facebook, and through testing, tried to bring it out of that environment to as many platforms as we felt was viable and found viable through testing.
Thanks, Clay. And I'll answer this one, and then I'm going to kick another one to James. What are your thoughts on how programs like this might exist in future election cycles if platforms continue to hamstring political advertising while letting bad actors radicalize users at scale with organic content algorithms that favor inflammatory content? Agree with all of those assessments in that question. And it's a really important question because as anyone who follows digital marketing and politics in this election knows, Facebook, which continues to be the most powerful platform to reach the most Americans, given the number of platforms they own and the data that they have and the sophistication of their platform, banned political ads. We were really outspoken very early at ACRONYM against that because there is a lot of good that ads that they classify as political and advocacy do, especially for small organizations and campaigns to raise money. Facebook has absolutely taken over from email in terms of grassroots donations, small dollar donations through campaigns, et cetera. And again, as we've mentioned and will continue to mention, the most disinformation actually spreads organically. So while we can counter it with paid ads, banning political ads does not actually, as we well know now, having gotten through the end of this election and the siege on the Capitol, deter disinformation or stop it from spreading on these platforms. So it's a very superficial solution that doesn't really solve the problem, but it is something that all advertisers and campaigns have to grapple with, as did we. Our media team was exceptionally patient and innovative because they also ran our Expand the Electorate program from the last session through the Georgia Senate runoffs when there were no Facebook ads until very, very, very soon before that election. So in the interest of how you can sort of apply this, I've said this a little bit, but one, I think it is critically important that on the left, we build more infrastructure and connectivity with organizing programs online to be able to share relationally and otherwise trusted information and content that has been tested or just is less likely to show backlash. And news is a really good format and type of content to do that based on everything we've learned, and does not need to be delivered only through paid advertising, of course. If you are on a text thread with your family where there are people who are middle of the road or soft Trump supporters or Republicans, what have you, that's one way to be able to challenge their belief systems. It doesn't mean that it always works, but if we do apply this the same way that we have to other types of content into these other spaces and do that organically, as Nick in the chat from Demcast has done with the infrastructure they've built, that can be effective. And as Clay just mentioned, other platforms that exist that are not banning ads of this nature. It's worth noting that media companies are not held to the same standard. And so they are able to have very persuasive political messages and not be banned when political ads are banned from putting money and targeting specific audiences. That is something that the right has benefited from. Facebook actually turned off the ability for more partisan news and disinformation to get into news feeds at the end of the election, and then immediately turned the ability back on because it is a driving force of revenue for them, given they have created a business model for disinformation. So it is possible for the platforms, which is critical that they play a role also in countering this problem. But going off of the platform is a way, and increasing our ability to spread trusted information organically into the spaces, the channels, the messaging groups, and apps where folks are that can be moved. James, there's a question on, let me find it, give me a second here. How would you recommend folks measure effectiveness of ads without having the resources to build the infrastructure that we had? And you should feel free to speak to how difficult and expensive that infrastructure was, because that is something we are also grappling with, knowing that it's not scalable or sustainable for everyone. So I'd love for you to speak to that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, one of the reasons the prime reason, in fact, that I felt called to help build all of the infrastructure we did build was because when we did this work in 2016, when I was at Facebook, we had a lot of tools that were internal to Facebook that the political advertisers in 2020 no longer had access to. So this was a problem, the sort of core problem, one step up, that we were trying to solve in building Barometer and Dorothy and Tornado. But it was extremely expensive. It was extremely painful. Running field experiments, which was the standard that drove most of our measurement in a live environment on Facebook with public opinion data, is probably one of the hardest things that you can do, period, because public opinion is really hard to measure generally, and running experiments in live environments is really hard because there's a lot of stuff that you don't control. So this was a big challenge for us even, right? To be able to marshal the level of technical resources, the level of funding, although we were lucky to have a lot of generous supporters that made that less of a problem. And just the level of time that we need. I think time was one of our biggest sort of limited resources that we had to deal with to produce what we did. I think though, at least on Facebook, I can give some really specific recommendations or any sort of platform that allows this type of engagement. And then I'll back up and give more abstract recommendations. The specific recommendations on Facebook are to really pay attention, not necessarily to like your engagement rate or the sort of very top level abstract metrics that often are reported out on for political creative, but to pay attention to the specific reactions, the specific engagements, and how they relate to the content and audience pairing that you have. As I mentioned before, if you have an ad that's meant to be comical in front of an audience of supporters, you should probably expect that if people think the ad is as funny as you do, that you'll get a lot of haha reactions. But if the ad is dead serious and you're in front of an audience of folks who are in the middle and you're getting a lot of ha-has, that's probably not a good thing. And so I think the sort of first rule is anytime there's context in the way that people interact with the creative that you're looking at. Of course, reactions in Facebook is a really good source of that, but I expect across platforms and mediums over time, we will see more expressive ways to react to creative. That resonance is real, and it's not real just because we hypothesized. It's real because we were able to show it through experiments. And then I think, secondly, more abstractly, I think it's really important, even if you don't have the time or the budget or the technical capability to do these massive field experiments. At the very least, there are a lot of really great survey experimentation platforms on the market, and I think these are valuable for lots of reasons, not the least of which they'll show you if your creative is at least driving backlash in a really resonant way. And so I highly recommend that if you have the ability to experiment, whether it's through survey experiments or whether it's through a sort of more involved, robust field experiments, that you do so, because that's the only way, short of training a model like we did on experimental results, to really know what's working and what's not.
Thanks, James. And I know that we are just about out of time. There were so many questions we didn't get to. I do want to mention one sort of thing, because there were a few questions about the backlash and persuasion decay that I think is really important. A part of our strategy, and I think Clay touched on it, but I want to make sure that folks hear it. That was something that we carried with us through all of our programs, and our ethos on this is that we do not believe in singular messages or ads as being as effective as narratives. So boosted news, that strategy is core to telling the same story that you can reinforce day in and day out. I tend to use the Fox News example of, immigrants are taking your jobs. They find a new way to tell that story every single day. We have to be telling offensive narratives, and boosted news and ads and just communications generally can all fit into that. And that's a framework that we did on this. And it's very difficult to have decay on a narrative the way that it is on one piece of creative or one news article. And so that guided our entire approach. But we are going to have, and this will be popping up in the chat all day, all of our case studies, including more information and presentation material and data on our boosted news programs and learnings at acronymplaybook.com. It just went live. That is also where the recordings of these sessions are going to be in perpetuity, so the community can access them. And so hopefully a lot more of the questions that we didn't get to right now can be answered through those materials, and of course, all of us as a resource. So thank you everybody so much for sticking with us with this one. We have a number of exciting more panels coming up on our approach to creative with a number of creative partners. And as I mentioned before, Sal's going to talk about how we did our audience definitions and chose our states and placed those bets. So thanks everybody so much for coming and being such a great and wonderful active audience.